Good evening. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. Today, we join nonprofit organizations across the world for Giving Tuesday. It's a global generosity movement that inspires hundreds of millions of people to act. This Giving Tuesday, we reflect on our Bedrock series, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. Dan's webinar perfectly exemplifies our mission. Each week, we bring a diverse audience together to grapple with the most timely issues. From week one of California's lockdown in March of 2020, your continued participation and financial support have made this series possible for over 82 weeks. 2022 will be a year full of new challenges for our small nonprofit, but we are committed to bringing you Dan's terrific weekly program and also continuing to create additional distinctive quality programming. So on this day of action, we ask that you make a donation to Politics in the Time of Coronavirus by going to our website at lawacth.org. It's now my pleasure to bring on our own politics professor, Dan Schnur.
Hey Kim, it's great to see you, and thanks so
Happy
much for the plug.
And happy holidays to you. I hope you had a little bit of a respite.
Yeah, I missed everybody last Tuesday, but I'm excited to be back.
We are so glad to have you back, and I'm just going to jump right into these two meaty topics that you're going to tackle today. First of all, Omicron, what we know about the new COVID variant so far, and secondly, why Kyle Rittenhouse will matter in the midterm elections. Take it away, Dan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kim, and thanks again to all of you for being with us this Tuesday, as many of you have been every week for well over a year and a half now. As Kim said, we're going to be talking about two different topics today, both of critical importance, and we're going to start by talking about the new COVID variant that is known as Omicron, which has emerged just in the last several days. And the most notable thing about Omicron, to date at least, is how much we don't know about it yet. So before we get started, before I start to go through the specifics of the topic and what it means economically, politically, and psychologically, I'd like to start out right away by asking Claire to help me out by putting up our very first question for all of you to weigh in as a benchmark for today's discussion. So question for all of you, how worried are you about this new COVID variant? Are you number one, extremely worried? Are you number two, somewhat worried? 30 is slightly worried? Or fourth, are you not worried at all? And let's see what our group has to say on this one, Claire. Oh, really interesting results. 55%, by far the biggest margin, somewhat worried, so somewhere in the middle. Not alarmed, as President Biden warned us about yesterday. Only 19% are extremely worried, at least so far. And then combined, 25% say slightly worried or not worried at all. So notable here, more than half of our group at least is somewhat worried, but not either panicked or taking it too lightly. And of course, as time passes, we'll come back to this question on a regular basis to track on how your attitudes change if they do change. So there is, just several days into this for most of us, a lot, an immense amount is still just unknown about this new variant. But specifically though, there are three major pieces of information that we're waiting for right now. The first, precisely how much more infectious is Omicron related to Delta and its other ancestors. And right now, at least the early information, I emphasize early, is this does look to be a much more transmittable variant than we've seen so far in the past of the previous iterations of COVID. Second question, does Omicron cause worse illness and more death? And that's really something we don't know yet. On one hand, the scientists are telling us that it is more easily and rapidly transmittable, but they're not yet certain. And their early instincts seem to be that it might not be quite as impactful or as damaging to us as Delta and the other predecessors. And third, and this is directly related to the second question, exactly how effectively does Omicron evade available vaccinations? Now, the makers of the world's two leading vaccines are now looking into that third question, and they said they'll have an answer for us on how effective their vaccines are against this new variant. They should have answers for us within about 2 weeks. And scientists everywhere around this country and around the world are working on those first two questions about transmittability and impact. But those answers are going to take a little bit longer. And in the meantime, what that means for us is a lot of uncertainty. A little bit of backstory today for those of you who might not have seen it. The variant, of course, was, as we all know, was first identified by South African researchers. But it's now unclear where and when it originated. And although we originally thought that it began in South Africa, the fact that it was first identified there doesn't mean that that's where its origin is. And the sooner we can ascertain that, the easier it'll be and the faster it'll be to understand how fast it spreads. Now, previously, the Netherlands said that it found the variant among passengers who came from South Africa last Friday. And that's the same day that the Dutch and other EU countries began imposing flight bans and other restrictions on South Africa and other countries in the southern part of the African continent. But just in the last day, there's new findings that indicate that the Omicron mutant coronavirus was already in Europe almost a week before South Africa sounded the alarm. And that indicates, of course, that Omicron had a much bigger head start in the Netherlands and perhaps elsewhere in Europe and around the world than previously believed. So narrowing down that origin is going to be of critical import. We still don't know, of course, the specifics of how the original COVID variant emerged in China 2 years ago now. And not having that information has made it much harder to fight. So whether this is something that was originated in South Africa, in Europe, or elsewhere is going to be of critical importance to answer the three questions I laid out just a couple minutes ago. Now, the economic impact of another round of COVID could be very considerable. Now, emphasis on the could, because once again, we simply don't know yet. But some analysts think that a serious economic downturn is probably going to be able to be something we can avoid this time around, mainly because so many people have been vaccinated and we know so much more about how to prepare for and how to protect ourselves against COVID, regardless of the variant, than we did in the spring of 2020. But bottom line, a lot of analysts think that we're probably not going to have the same kind of economic downturn that we did last year because so many people have been vaccinated. But they also think that a return to pre-pandemic levels of economic activity, especially in tourism and leisure and in the service industries, may be dramatically delayed, even if this isn't all that serious a variant. The stock market had its biggest drop of the year on Friday, primarily on leisure and travel holdings. And just today, Jeremy Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, he said today that Omicron could lead the current inflationary trends we've been suffering through to extend and to last even further, given ongoing potential economic uncertainty. So that's the economic impact. But particularly for the reasons we talked about earlier, these three big unknowns, the psychological impact on many of us, on most of us, could be even greater. Research shows that people actually tend to be calmer when they're anticipating certain pain, an electric shock, for example, as opposed to a 50% chance of getting a shock. So if you know something's is going to cause you pain, you're ready for it, and therefore you don't get nearly as upset by it. Whereas if you're not sure whether that pain is going to come or not, you're not nearly as calm. You're a lot more excited. In other studies, moving from physical pain to other types of dislocation, other studies show that uncertainty about possible job loss is much more damaging to our psychological and physical health than actually losing our job. So the uncertainty about Omicron is the hardest part too. And that leads to the potential political impact of this new variant. President Biden and most other world leaders right now are erring on the side of caution. One White House advisor was quoted earlier today as saying, quote, "We'd rather be criticized for doing something that turned out to be unnecessary than to not do something that turned out should have been done." And that was the rationale, for example, for the travel ban from South Africa and the several other countries on the African continent. But erring on the side of caution only goes so far, given the experience we've had over the last year and a half or so. You may have noticed that yesterday, President Biden talked a lot about vaccines. He talked a lot about boosters, about masks, and about social distancing precautions. But he very noticeably ruled out the prospect of more shutdowns. Because Biden recognizes not just how polarized we've become over COVID, but how exhausted we are by it. And so what we heard from him yesterday, as I mentioned earlier, the mantra we heard from him and will continue to hear is, quote, "Cause for concern, but not cause for panic." And it looks like most of our group is subscribing to that concept. Now, whether that turns out to be the right communication strategy for Biden is going to be driven a lot more by biology and pharmaceuticals than politics. But Biden and his advisors know that COVID may have, more than anything else, COVID may have been what gave him the presidency last year. And Biden and his team are very aware that the emergence of the Delta variant has been a major contributor to his loss of public and political support over the last several months. So a new variant, frankly, is the last thing they want, not just for economic and health reasons, but for political reasons too. Now, look, there's a long way to go until next November, but no incumbent wants something like this to be the issue driving the election season, especially the president. And so in my mind, at least, the biggest political news of the day didn't come out of the White House or out of Congress, but rather out of the Food and Drug Administration. Because earlier today, an FDA panel decided to approve a COVID-19 pill from Merck Pharmaceuticals. And that pill, if it's approved by the overall FDA, would lead to a medication that we could take at home to treat the virus. And that pill could be approved within a month. So we're going to find out over the next few weeks how transmittable the virus is. We're going to find out how damaging it is. And we're going to find out how effective vaccines can be in protecting us against it. But keep an eye on the FDA and keep an eye on the Merck pill, because for health reasons and for economic and psychological reasons and for political reasons, that little pill could end up being a game changer in all sorts of directions, and also for all sorts of reasons. And of course, we'll continue to come back and follow that story going forward for the rest of this year and next year too. Let's move on though. Oh wait, before we do, Claire, thank you for the reminder. Claire, we've got a second question on this topic for our group. So for all of you, We talked about what you think about the impact on all of us of the new variant. The question here, what do you think will be the political impact of Omicron? Number one, do you think it'll help Biden and hurt Republicans? Number two, do you think it will help Republicans and hurt Biden? Or third, do you feel like it's not going to give either side a political advantage in the midterm elections next year? And how do we declare? Wow, look at that. Only 8% believe it's an issue that will help Biden. And what that suggests to me, Claire, Jessica, Kim, I'll be interested when we talk later, whether you agree or not, is only 8% of our group thinks it's an issue that helps Biden. That means, at least in my mind, that a relatively small percentage of us think that it's a challenge that's going to be resolved in the near to medium future. 44% think it'll help Republicans and hurt Biden. 48%, neither side will gain an advantage. But look at those top two rows. If you take out the 48% that really doesn't lean in either direction, that means by more than a 5-to-1 margin, our group thinks that this is an issue that's going to help Republicans in the midterm elections. And in a fight for a very closely contested Congress, that obviously could be a real difference maker. Let's move on, though. Let's move on to our second topic. And we're going to talk for a while now, not just about Kyle Rittenhouse, but about Ahmaud Arbery, about the Waukesha tragedy, about criminal justice in America. But let's start with Kyle Rittenhouse, the 18-year-old, who was found not guilty last week on charges of homicide that had been leveled against him in the riots after the Jacob Blake killing in Kenosha, Wisconsin last August. Then in short order, just days later, we saw guilty verdicts issued against the 3 Georgia men who'd killed Ahmaud Arbery. And then right after that, we saw a tragedy in Waukesha, Wisconsin last week, where a man drove his SUV into a crowd attending a holiday parade that resulted in 6 deaths and dozens of serious injuries. And then just today, horribly, for those of you who hadn't yet heard, earlier today in Oakland County, Michigan, which is just north of Detroit, a 15-year-old high school student opened fire with a semi-automatic handgun. And the last I saw, I haven't checked the news on this for a little while, he killed 3 of his fellow students and seriously injured 5 other students and one of the high school's teachers. So that's a lot to get through on the criminal justice and public safety front. So let's start with Rittenhouse. And let's start our discussion of Kyle Rittenhouse with a question for all of you. So a question for our group. How do you feel about the verdict in the Kyle Rittenhouse case? Pretty straightforward here. Number 1, I agreed with the verdict. 2, I disagreed with the verdict. The third, don't know, I'm not really sure, or have no opinion. Let's see what we got from our group on this one, Claire, if we can. Very interesting. 76% disagreed with the verdict. 17% agreed, which means by roughly, if I do the math quickly in my head, that means roughly a 5-to-1 margin. Our group thought that the jury's verdict was wrong. And let's step back. We're going to come back to that in just a moment, but let's step back for just a second. As many of you think of Kyle Rittenhouse as a villain, a smaller number of you may see him as a hero. And we see a pretty pronounced division across the country on that question, not just over the last couple of weeks, but ever since he was originally charged last August. So many Americans regard him as a courageous citizen who is looking to protect a besieged community. Many other Americans see him as a racist vigilante out to wreak havoc. Personally, I saw a frightened and confused teenager who got himself involved in something much bigger and much more dangerous than he could have possibly understood, with fatal and tragic consequences. Now, it's been noted frequently that Rittenhouse was not found innocent. Rather, a verdict of not guilty simply means that his acts of violence did not surpass the very precise legal standard of self-defense that protects many of those who use deadly force when they believe they're facing the threat of death or great bodily harm. Now, according to Wisconsin state law, lethal force is only legally permissible if someone, quote, reasonably believes that such force is necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm to himself or herself, unquote. And I'm going to read that again. Lethal force in the state of Wisconsin is only legally permissible if someone, quote, reasonably believes that such force is necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm to himself or herself. So even if a defendant provokes the confrontation, they're still allowed legally to resort to deadly force if those criteria are met and the jury decides that they've exhausted every other reasonable means of escape. That's the sole criteria, the only basis to be considered, not the reason that Rittenhouse was in Kenosha in the first place, not whether the people he shot thought they were chasing an assailant who had just killed someone, which Rittenhouse did not at that point, but it's entirely possible that they thought he did. The only thing the jury was allowed to consider is whether Rittenhouse believed at the time, whether they agreed or not, looking at the videos that were taken. The question they were supposed to consider was, did Rittenhouse believe that this was his only option to avoid imminent death or great bodily harm? And so through that very specific lens, the decision shouldn't have been a surprising one. But it's important to remember that the jury made a legal decision, not a moral one. And so for many who disagreed with the decision, I think it is important to look back at the law in existence that the jury was instructed to use before coming to its conclusion. Now, it's unlikely that anyone on either side of this debate is going to change their initial opinion of the verdict. This trial is yet another reminder of how polarized and how deeply divided a nation we've become. That chasm has grown to a place where there are no serious conversations taking place about whether, at least that I know of, about whether a tragedy like this one can provide the opportunity for learning or growing or healing, or for recognizing that there are still common bonds of humanity that link us together despite our partisan and our ideological differences. And sadly, the reason those conversations aren't taking place is because most of us know how futile they'd be. That is, if the thought even occurred to us at all. But what I'd ask you, whether you thought the verdict was the right one or the wrong one, I'd ask you to imagine even the slightest of possibilities that someone who disagrees with you or me on the verdict is neither stupid or evil. And maybe it's worth entertaining the idea, even if just for a moment, that while there are certainly angry and vile haters on the far extremes on the other side, however you define the other side, most of the people over there who came to a different conclusion about the verdict, my own opinion is that most of the people over there, however you define over there, are good and decent people too. and they want to live in safe and trusting communities, much as you and I do. And those people over there on the other side, they despise senseless violence just as much as we do. The only difference is that they had come to a different conclusion about the intricacies of Wisconsin statute on gun possession and self-defense. And finding a way to have a conversation with those with whom we disagree, particularly on such difficult issues, is ultimately, as we've talked about many times on this program before, the key to finding a way to build some bridges to the other side, and if not eliminate the ideological divide, which is not a practical thing to do, at least lessen it so people on both sides of that division can have more rational conversations than currently take place in politics and elsewhere. Now, speaking of senseless violence, the Arbery case can remind us of the scope of challenges that still exist, but also that the legal system is still, even if imperfect, is still most often the best place to address those challenges. Last Wednesday, just a few days after the Rittenhouse verdict, 3 men were found guilty of murdering Ahmaud Arbery, who was a 25-year-old unarmed black man, after they suspected him of committing a series of break-ins in their neighborhood outside the city of Brunswick in South Georgia. The guilty verdicts suggested that the jury agreed with the prosecutor's argument that Mr. Arbery, who was jogging and who the defendants argued they thought was fleeing from the scene of a crime, posed no imminent threat to the men, and that the men had no reason to believe he'd committed a crime, giving them no legal right to chase him through their neighborhood. So even though the laws in Georgia are somewhat different in Wisconsin, the basic difference here is that the Georgia jury believed that Arbery's killers did have options available to them, that the jury in Wisconsin felt that were simply not available to Rittenhouse. So Claire, let's put up our next question. We asked our group about Rittenhouse verdict. Let's ask them about the Arbery trial. How do you feel about the guilty verdict in the Ahmaud Arbery case? Do you agree with the verdict, number 1? Number 2, do you disagree with the verdict? Or again, number 3, don't know, no opinion. What do you think? Wow, even more pronounced than we saw for the Rittenhouse verdict. That was a 5-to-1 ratio who disagreed, but by a 97-to-1% margin here, our group at least hardly agreed with the jury verdict. So I'm going to ask a follow-up question right away. We're not going to waste any time at all. I want to take the question about the Arbery case and broaden it out slightly. So yeah, thank you, Claire. We have our 5th question for the day. More broadly, not just on this case specifically, but more broadly, can an individual from a minority community, can someone who lives in and represents the community of color, can someone from a minority community get a fair trial in the US legal system in 2021? And the options here, as you can see, are all of the time, most of the time, some of the time, rarely, and never. Very interesting. 66% of you picked out some middle ground on that. That's some of the time, not all or most, but some of the time. Someone from a minority community can get a fair trial. If you look at the rest of those numbers and sort of discount our middle group, no offense, by roughly a 2-to-1 margin, our group at least believes that someone from a minority community can get a fair trial in this country all or most of the time. 22% if you add up those top 2 categories. And only 12% said rarely or never. So that's the basis for some optimism. And I hope in particularly for those of you who disagreed with the Rittenhouse verdict, the answer we saw to that last question can provide us some guidance going forward. Now, we're still learning the details of the Darrell Brooks attack on the parade goers in Wisconsin last week. And information is, of course, just hours after the tragedy. Information is still being gathered as to what drove today's shooting in Michigan. But I'll get back to the point I was making earlier about the deep disagreements over the Rittenhouse verdict. As long as we assume that people who disagree with us on these types of questions are to be hated or dismissed, the divisions in our society are going to deepen, and more and more people are going to decide the only way to be heard is through violence. So now, before I ask Jessica to join us, I'm going to talk for just a minute about the politics of all this as it relates to the midterm elections. And once again, I'm going to focus on the Rittenhouse verdict because it was the most divisive of the examples we've been discussing. Because my own opinion is that the early reaction from our nation's political leaders on the Rittenhouse verdict was not encouraging. President Biden issued a statement that was conciliatory, but not especially emphatic. Vice President Harris was resentful and barely made an effort to conceal her anger. And Donald Trump, on the other side, very enthusiastically applauded the decision. So the net effect from our political leaders, not just Trump and Harris, but of any number of electeds, both Republican and Democrat, the net effect of this tragedy was to deepen our political divisions even further. Now, what this means for next year's elections is yet another issue that both parties will use to both parties will turn to the most extreme possible alternatives to motivate their bases. And this will become another issue on which those who are at or close to the political center who'd like to see some reasonable common ground on criminal justice and policing issues will get ignored. Midterm elections, we've discussed this many times in previous episodes of this webinar. Midterm elections are much more about motivating a party's base and turning out true believers on both sides, as opposed to presidential campaigns in which there's some effort to persuade undecided voters to move toward one side or the other. So the way the parties are approaching criminal justice and policing issues today is not a unique approach in 21st century politics, but it's particularly dangerous because of the passions it inflames and the violence, as we've seen and discussed, that too often results. And the political incentives next November are huge, they're immense. So both parties have a very strong motivation to take these very delicate and sensitive questions and challenges and turn them into partisan wrecking balls. Now, my very early guess is that Democrats have somewhat more of an incentive to move toward the center on criminal justice issues, if only because the message from their base is much less palatable to centrist voters than it was last summer in the aftermath of the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor tragedies. As those centrist voters become more and more concerned about the prospect of violent crime. This is another issue that we'll talk about fairly regularly throughout the midterm election year. But right now, it's not just a volatile issue, it's a very dangerous one, is both parties stake out the most extreme positions possible to rally their bases. And even if many of us know there's common sense solutions somewhere in the middle, let's agree that a midterm election year is probably not the best time to find those common sense solutions. Okay, I went a little bit over today, and I will apologize for that. But Jessica, if you're still willing to join me, yes, you are.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, as Kim mentioned, today is Giving Tuesday, and organizations like ours are so grateful for any donations that you can make. In fact, Baby Duganzik made his or her first Giving Tuesday charitable contribution to the council today, as I've really enjoyed learning about the world and hearing Dan explain all these important topics all these months. So the baby is happy to support the work that my wonderful colleagues and Dan are doing for our community. I'll put a link to the donation page in the chat, and we appreciate anything that you can give. Thank you so much. All right, let's hop over to these questions. The first, what is taking US intelligence so long to determine COVID-19 origin when Biden tasked them to do so last spring?
Okay. I'm sorry, Jessica, can you repeat that?
Sure. So what is taking so long to discover the origins of COVID-19 when Biden assigned them this task last spring?
Okay. More than anything, at least as I read it, and there are other factors I might be missing, but it's fairly clear that a lack of cooperation and a real resistance from Chinese government authorities has by far been the biggest obstacle to coming to a better understanding of COVID's origins. From the very beginning, the Chinese were extremely uncooperative with World Health Association scientists, and that really hasn't changed over time. And as the months pass, it's going to become less and less likely to identify these kind of causes because the medical clues are going to be much less in evidence. So I know that there are other aspects to it, but at the risk of oversimplifying, it appears to me that the Chinese government simply does not want the world understanding the origins of this for whatever their reasons, and that more than anything else has prevented further research to be successful.
How do you see the impact of Representatives Bobert and Green?
Okay. Well, for those of you who've been part of the webinars in the past, you know I don't have a lot of use for the most extreme voices in either party. And both Representatives Bobert and Green, two of the most conservative members of the Republican caucus, have both been involved in yet an additional round of controversies this week. And I don't think either of their statements or actions are at all beneficial to the political conversation. But I hasten to point out that there are equally, or at least roughly equally, intolerable voices on the far left extreme. And while we can certainly point to examples of outrageous and unacceptable behavior on either side, I think one of the greatest dangers for all of us is to engage in what I call selective outrage, which is finding ways to, if not overlook, to minimize unacceptable behavior from someone on my side of the line, while offering appropriate levels of condemnation against those on the other. If you're going to call out bad behavior on both sides, if you can call out bad behavior, you need to do it on both sides. But both Representative Bobert and Representative Taylor Greene, in my opinion, are excellent examples of political leaders who deserve to be called out for their excesses.
Isn't the travel ban on South Africa counterproductive as it penalizes South Africa for its prompt reporting of the Omicron variant?
So this is a really difficult question because South Africa, because as the questioner referenced, has such a well-developed and successful method of tracing and identifying COVID outbreaks in their country. They are now suffering economic and diplomatic consequences as a result. And it's fairly clear that the countries, including the US, that have announced travel bans from South Africa are not entirely comfortable with that because they recognize that South Africa is being penalized. That said, if there was a lesson to be learned from the original COVID outbreak in late 2019, early 2020, it's that these types of travel bans can slow down. They can't stop, but even if they can slow down the spread by a number of days, that can be of immeasurable value in protecting vulnerable populations. As I said during the first half of the program, as of today's news, we now don't know whether the virus originated in South Africa or somewhere in Europe or elsewhere, and if South Africa just happened to identify it more quickly than Dutch authorities or authorities in other countries. But my own opinion is that while South Africa is being somewhat unfairly penalized, there really is no recourse for other countries who do want to do everything they can to protect their own populations. Not an ideal situation in any way, shape, or form, but the very, very short answer, Jessica, would be unfair, but probably necessary.
Thank you. Sorry, get back up here. Did the Rittenhouse trial and the media hysteria show America's dangerous turn to unconstitutional ideas that people are guilty until proven innocent?
Well, look, one of the key precepts of the legal system in this country and elsewhere is that someone is innocent until proven guilty. That's a legal standard. What no one's been able to figure out a way yet is how to apply that legal standard to human emotions. It's human nature to want to solve problems as quickly as possible, which means sometimes unfairly. It's also human nature to want to assign blame and identify a villain as quickly as possible. And so we do leap to conclusions on both sides of the aisle, liberals and conservatives. And whether or not you happen to agree with the Rittenhouse decision, the Arbery decision, or other equally contentious cases in recent US history, making sure that the decision is made by a legal standard and not by an emotional rush to judgment is a critical tenet, if not the basic fundamental base of our legal system. Human nature is to be impatient. We don't want to just identify those villains. We want to identify them quickly and then take them away. So just like criticizing two Republican representatives but not acknowledging similar excesses on the Democratic side is engaging in selective outrage, I think pointing to those on the political left who immediately assumed that Rittenhouse was guilty before the trial could be completed is a similar example of selective outrage, because there's plenty of times that's been done on the right, not just the left.
Do you think Rittenhouse has a case to sue political leaders like Biden, who called him a white supremacist, or media personalities who continued to call him a murderer after the verdict came out?
Boy, I'm not a legal expert, and so I don't know what his legal recourse is in these types of situations. There is probably, and I emphasize the word probably because this is not my area of expertise, there's probably a case to be made in some instances for charges of slander, given that the court has ruled not finding him innocent, but finding him not guilty. But I also believe, as a lay person watching the legal process play out, is that because there is a very important distinction between innocence, which was not the verdict, and not guilty, which was, I wonder if that still doesn't give a critic license to engage in that kind of language against him. I don't know the answer to the question, but I will offer, going back to the point I was trying to make during the first part of the webinar today, is that engaging in that kind of extremely harsh criticism doesn't do anything to bring us back together after a tragedy. In fact, it probably makes it even harder.
On your second topic, don't you think these shooting incidents and the many others indicate our governments have lost control of the monopoly on violence, which is one of the basic reasons for government?
Well, I don't know that government has ever had a monopoly on either violence or weaponry. And there is a Second Amendment conversation to be had here among strong advocates on both sides. But rather than engaging in that debate today, I'd point out, not philosophically, but just realistically, I don't know that there's ever been a society in which the government had an absolute monopoly on violence. Now, should a 17-year-old have had access to that type of weapon? That's a reasonable discussion to have. But if you start with the supposition that only government should, the government should have an absolute monopoly on weaponry, that's a more difficult conversation. But even as far as I know, the most ambitious gun control advocates do not suggest there should be no weapons in society at all. Just a question under which they are available to citizens. And even under those cases, certainly nothing remotely resembling a monopoly would exist.
With the millions of guns in the public's hands, what kind of legislation can be passed to control sales of guns?
Well, in many states, including my state of California, very aggressive legislation has been passed limiting citizens' access to certain types of weapons and to certain types of ammunition. And in fact, just today, the courts ruled in favor of the state of California's ban on ammunition necessary to use assault weapons. And it's widely assumed that that will lay the predicate for a follow-up court decision, which upholds the California law banning many types of assault weapons. So there are laws on the books in many states around the country that do just what the questioner is asking about. Passing that kind of legislation on a federal level is much, much more difficult. One, for reasons having to do with the nature of our republic, decisions made at the state versus made at the federal level, but also remembering that there are very deep divisions, not only political but cultural divisions in our country about what kind of weapons should be accessible to law-abiding citizens. Those of us in a blue state like California or New York come to very strong conclusions on one side of that discussion. Those in a red state or in a rural or exurban area in other parts of the country are going to come to an equally strong decision. So finding a national consensus that would allow federal laws to be passed is very, very difficult. The last time such a thing was accomplished was in the early 1990s, when Bill Clinton's administration fought very hard for an assault weapons ban. And it's worth remembering that in the aftermath of the assault weapons ban passage, Democrats lost their majorities in the United States Congress for the first time in almost 40 years. And when the ban passed as a temporary prohibition, expired several years later, there was not a serious effort in either party to extend it. So legally speaking, states can pass those type of restrictions, of course, but recognizing the deep cultural and philosophical and political disagreements in this country over the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms and what types of weapons ought to be available to citizens makes a federal law just incredibly difficult to achieve.
An MSNBC reporter followed the jurors' van, even running a red light to stay with the van, which makes it seem like the media is intimidating juries. Should there be policies against this, specifically journalists stalking jurors to protect our judicial system?
I don't know what a law like that would look like, but I would argue very strongly that whether that journalist was with MSNBC or Fox News, or with the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, that showing basic decency and respect to citizens fulfilling their civic responsibility is something that ought to be expected of all of us, regardless of our profession. My understanding is that the MSNBC contractor, not a full-time employee, was removed from their position as a result of this. I believe that that's the case. But it's the type of excessive behavior that, going back to the point I was making in the first 30 minutes, just deepens the divisions. And whether that reporter happens to be from a left-leaning or right-leaning outlet, that's really not the role of a journalist. And overstepping those boundaries takes a very challenging, very divisive situation and makes it even worse.
Currently, there exists videos and information from those who are against the vaccine that claim other countries, such as Australia, now has a dictator as a leader who they actually believe is forcing vaccines. Do you see more of these extreme claims being made as we near elections, and what are the dangers of this to our democracy?
I do see more of these claims being made, not just about COVID, but on a whole range of issues, and not just as we approach next year's election, but going forward. And we've talked in the past, and Jessica, maybe we're overdue for making social media one of our topics for a weekly webinar. But I would say that whether it's old style internet or social media, the fact that an individual can rely completely on sources for news and information or opinion that only tell one side of the story, and often in an exaggerated and misleading and completely untrue manner, is one of the greatest drivers of the type of division I was talking to earlier. Almost 20 years ago, Nick Kristof, the New York Times columnist who just resigned to run for governor of the state of Oregon, Nick Kristof wrote a great column at the dawn of the internet age called The Me Network. And this was long before Facebook, long before social media. He was talking about the original type of online engagement. And what Kristof argued in the column, and I think it's even more true today than it was when he wrote it, is that for all the incredible benefits that come with advances in communications technology, and make no doubt and have no doubt about it, I believe that the advantages of those advances far outweigh the downside. But even along with all those benefits, the downside is that every one of us can construct what I would call an information igloo, in which we only access news of some sort or other that never presents us a dissenting opinion, never disagrees with us, never challenges us, but only reinforces what we already believe and congratulates us for believing it. And whether that news source is on the right with Fox News and other extremely conservative sources, whether it's on the left with MSNBC or Pod Save America or other left-leaning news and information sources, as long as we ensconce ourselves in that kind of bubble, it becomes easier and easier to believe even the most outlandish and ridiculous charges. You may or may not agree with what Australia's leaders are doing when it comes to COVID, but calling their leaders dictators is way beyond the pale. But I hear similar extremes argued on both sides. And for those of you who are regular participants in this webinar, you've heard me say before that on the last day of the semester, and I'll do it tomorrow at USC and I'll do it next week at Berkeley, on the last day of every semester, I tell my students, I'm going to give them one last assignment. And in that last assignment, I tell them it's the most important thing I'm going to assign them all semester long, but I can't grade it. I tell them I want every principled conservative in the class to watch Rachel Maddow once a week. I tell them that I want every principled progressive in the class to read George Will or Bret Stephens once a week. Not to try to change their minds, but just to make sure they're exposed to really smart people across the ideological spectrum. Because when you isolate yourself and you pretend that the only people on the other side are the real freaks and weirdos, well, then the kind of invective that you were just reading, Jessica, becomes much easier to believe. You can be a principled progressive and still read smart conservatives. You can be a principled conservative and still listen to smart liberals. But if you're not willing to expose yourself to smart people with whom you disagree, it's a pretty short path down the road to thinking that there's a dictator of Australia.
Is there any legal protected right in the US Constitution that guarantees freedom of choice to deny or resist a COVID vaccination mandate by the US president, by city government over city employee, by state government over state employee?
Well, this is the question that courts are wrestling with right now at every level. At what point does a government have the authority to mandate a test or a vaccine? And as those cases make their way through the courts at the local, state, and federal level, we'll get a lot more guidance than we have to date. to me, and I'll admit some bias on this one, just because I've never seen any controversy about vaccines for smallpox or polio or the flu. I've never thought it was really that big of a deal. But there are obviously people who very strongly disagree, and the courts right now are weighing the very question that was asked. We're not going to know that answer anytime soon, but whether it's the Biden administration, whether it's the state government, or local authorities in LA, San Diego, and elsewhere around our state and around the country, mandates that seem logically like they would have been legally and constitutionally appropriate are now being considered by the courts. And I suspect this is an area of jurisprudence on which we've barely scratched the surface, and we'll be watching this fought out for years to come.
Do you have a comment about the differences in treatment of the Trump ban on entry from some countries, claims of terrible personal conduct, and the quiet about a ban on entry from predominantly Black African countries?
I don't have a good answer to the question. The one difference I'll note is that even if you disagree strongly with Biden and other world leaders' decision to impose a travel ban on African countries, I didn't hear Biden or any of the other world leaders using ethnically or racially charged language to talk about the ban in the way that Trump did when talking about a virus originating in China, the so-called Kung flu, et cetera. And so there's a broader debate, which it's not my role in this webinar to take sides in, but I think one important distinction between the two bans is not the legal and practical impact of them, but rather the type of language that's used in imposing them. And for those of you who think I'm being unfair to Republicans, I'll point back to the immediate aftermath of the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, when Republican President George W. Bush went to great lengths to talk about the valued contributions that most followers of the Islam faith made to our society, and how the Republican president of the United States visited a mosque only days after 9/11 to demonstrate that sentiment to the American people. So neither party has a corner on this, but I do see, if not a difference between the two travel bans, I think what's critically important is the language used in taking such dramatic steps. I think that difference is a fairly apparent one.
Why hasn't the US adopted pandemic controls other countries have, which is not to order travel bans, but to require all travelers to quarantine for 10, 14, 21 days in a government-run quarantine hotel? Wouldn't that work better?
Well, there's trade-offs, and this is the political debate that's going on right now. On one hand, the more strict shutdowns, whether it's in terms of travel bans or quarantines or any of the other things we've talked about, on one hand, while that does prevent or at least delay the spread of the virus, it also, as we've learned, has considerable economic and psychological impacts as well. So why is there such a considered debate in this country more than there are in other places? Well, the nature of American politics over the last several years has been this extraordinary polarization that I was talking about earlier. And I have to admit, if you had told me 10 years ago that a worldwide pandemic would cause us to become more divided, even more polarized than we had been, as opposed to bringing us together the way a world war or the terrorist attacks of 2001 did, I'm not sure I would have believed you. But longer conversation for another day, because our politics has become not just polarized, but almost tribalized. I think very strong, true believers on both sides of the aisle become that much less willing to listen even to reasonable arguments from the other side. And if you watch President Biden tiptoeing as he did yesterday, talking about boosters and vaccines and masks on one hand, but speaking very strongly against the possibility of shutdowns, that's because he recognizes how divided the country is on this. And even if he were to decide in the future that a shutdown would make sense, you can bet that before he made the decision, he would think through very carefully whether it was a decision that would divide a divided country to an even further and more dangerous degree.
Well, thank you so much, Dan. That hour flew by. So to our audience, thank you for all of your great questions. And we have an after the webinar session for our members that'll start in a few minutes. So if you're interested in joining those, become a member and email our membership director, Rachel Kenderdine, so she can sign you up for that.
And thank you, Jessica. And before we hand it back to Kim, my amazing wife, Cecile, very politely pointed out to me, just as we were switching to questions, that I somehow invented a man by the name of Jeremy Powell. As most of you know, the chair of the Federal Reserve's name is Jerome Powell. If any of you know a Jeremy Powell, I'd be eager to meet him someday, but I don't really put a lot of stock into his economic forecasts, so I stand corrected.
Sounds good. Thank you, Cecile. All right, back to you, Kim.
Thank you, Jessica. Dan, as always, that was such a terrific session. You provide us such meaningful analysis that moves us beyond the partisan political noise, and we're so grateful for all you do for our organization.
Well, thank you so much, Kim. That really means a lot to me. And thanks again to all of you who join us every week. These are really wonderful conversations, and I'm glad that so many of our group participates in them and benefits from them.
And our viewers appreciate you so much too. We hear that from all of the surveys that we send out immediately after your programs. And for our viewers, thank you all for your continued viewership and your sharp, smart questions and your support of our organization. So please, as it is Giving Tuesday, please go to our website at lawacth.org and give what you can to keep us going. Dan, we're looking forward to seeing you in just a few minutes at your special after the webinar roundtable. But if you stick with me just for a second, I just want to bring the viewers to the attention of our upcoming programs. We have on December 2nd, Dr. Michael Drake, who is the president of the University of California. He will be speaking about the role of higher education in California's future. Then next week, we also have a very special member film screening, Who We Are, a chronicle of racism in America. So you'll be able to view the film as a member December 6th through the 9th. And then on the 9th, we will also have a live conversation with the film's co-directors and the subject and writer, Jeffrey Robinson. Of course, next Tuesday, December 7th, we have Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. And on the 15th, we have the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Japan and Korea, Mark Baxter Lambert. So please go to our website, sign up today, and we hope to see you this Thursday with Dr. Michael Drake. So we better go, and you've got people waiting for you, as always, Dan.